Good afternoon, good morning, or evening, depending on where you are joining us today. Welcome to the Fall 2025 webinar series, The Sand Creek Massacre Remembered, Truth-Telling as a Path to Healing. My name is Amy Hong, and I serve as the Assistant General Secretary of Programs at the General Board of Church and Society in Washington, D.C., housed in the United Methodist Building. The United Methodist Building is located in Washington, D.C., on the ancestral homelands of the Anacostan people who lived for generations neighboring the Piscataway and the Pamunkey people. We gratefully acknowledge the Native people on whose ancestral homelands we gather and the diverse Native communities who make their home here today. As we continue this webinar, for participants who are blind, low vision, or perhaps are only listening, I am a Korean American woman with black hair tied back, wearing a white sweater sitting in front of a sage green background. In the early morning hours of November 29, 1864, the 3rd Colorado Cavalry, made up of 675 men under the command of Colonel John Chivington, a Methodist minister and political opportunist, attacked a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho encampment in the bend of Big Sand Creek located in southern eastern Colorado Territory. The attack lasted for 8 hours, resulting in the deaths of approximately 230 Cheyenne and Arapaho people, most of whom were women, children, and the elders. The United Methodist Book of Resolutions, number 4263, states, "We acknowledge that too often in the past and yet today, Christian individuals and the church as an institution have been agents of death rather than protectors of life. Clergy and lay leaders who were trained, respected, and honored by the Methodist Episcopal Church use their influences through the church, the government, and the military in ways that cause profound harm to Indian people at Sand Creek, including killing nearly 230 peaceful Indians camped under the protection of the U.S. government and desecrating the bodies of the slain. We acknowledge that leading up to the massacre, during the massacre, and in the aftermath of the massacre, representatives of the church utterly failed to uphold gospel values of respect for human life. As spiritual descendants, we are called to continue the journey of truth-telling, repentance, and healing in relationship with the descendants of the Sand Creek Massacre. This webinar series, along with the Sand Creek Massacre exhibit currently at the United Methodist Building, is part of the work and journey of truth-telling, repentance, and healing. A short overview of our time together. After the presentation, there will be a time of Q&A. So please enter your questions in the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen. I am honored to introduce you to our speaker for today. Professor Ari Kelman is Chancellor's Leadership Professor of History at the University of California, Davis. He is the author, most recently of Battle Lines, A Graphic History of the Civil War, as well as A Misplaced Massacre, Struggling Over the Memory of Sand Creek, which won many awards, including the Internet Forrester Downing Book Award, the Avery O. Craven Award, the Bancroft Prize, the Tom Watson Brown Book Award, and the Robert M. Utley Prize. He also wrote A River and Its City, The Nature of Landscape in New Orleans, which won the Abbott Lowell Cummings Prize. Professor Kelman's essays and articles have appeared in Slate, the Christian Science Monitor, The Nation, the Times Literary Supplement, the Journal of Urban History, the Journal of American History, Reviews in American History, among others. Dr. Kelman has contributed to outreach endeavors aimed at K-12 educators and to public history projects, including documentary films for the History Channel and PBS's American Experiences series. He has received numerous grants and fellowships, including most notably from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Huntington Library. He is now working on a book titled For Liberty and Empire, How the Civil War Bled into the Indian Wars. Professor Kelman, thank you so much for being with us today. We are so excited for your presentation.
Thanks for having me. Thanks so much for that very, very kind introduction. Thanks to all of you who are joining us from around the country, and it looks like from around the world. I'm very honored to be here with you today. I'm going to talk briefly about the Sand Creek Massacre itself. Then I'm going to talk about the way that people struggled over its memory over a long period of time. And finally, I'll spend the bulk of my time with you discussing the creation of the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site, which is a unit of the National Park System. And the process of creating that site was, as you'll hear, unusually complicated. And so I'm going to take a moment, forgive me while I get my slides working. This will just take 1 second, I believe. Okay. My hope is that all of you now see just a black screen. And I'm going to repeat some of what you've heard just a moment ago, just by way of context. On November 29th, 1864, approximately 700 troops from the 1st and 3rd Colorado regiments. These were volunteer soldiers during the United States Civil War. They were led by a colonel named John Shivington. These men together attacked an Arapaho and Cheyenne peace camp that was nestled in a bend of what today is called Sand Creek, located in southeastern Colorado Territory. You can get oriented on this map. I hope that you're all able to see it. You can see the Sand Creek Massacre site located on what is the eastern portion of Colorado's plains, close to what is marked as Big Sandy Creek. On November 29th, 1864, there were something like 900 Native people in this camp. These people believed that they had recently made peace with white authorities in Colorado Territory and representatives of the federal government. When the attack began, they fled up what at that time of year was a dry creek bed. The onslaught left something like 230, as you heard, perhaps as many as 250 or more people dead. The overwhelming majority of those people were women, children, or the elderly. Colonel Shivington's surviving troops disgraced themselves by combing that killing field for grim trophies. The scalps, fingers, and even genitalia that they hacked from the dead bodies of their victims. Now I'm going to flash way forward now from 1864 to the spring of 2007. So we're talking nearly a century and a half later. This is April 28th, 2007, when the United States National Park Service opened its 391st unit, the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site, as you see here. The ceremony that day was equal parts celebration and memorial service. Drum groups went silent. A Cheyenne chief offered a prayer. Then members of Congress, Colorado's governor, leaders of 4 Native nations, and Park Service officials all explained what the site might accomplish for different communities. They noted in common that they were together honoring the victims of the Sand Creek Massacre, they said. Some of them also said that this site promised healing to the affected tribes. Others noted that the opening of this historic site offered a blueprint for future cooperation between Native peoples and federal authorities. Collective remembrance, the act of remembering the past, even a difficult, bloody chapter from the past, they suggested, if it was situated in a sufficiently sacred place, could somehow seal a rift that had been cut over time by violence between cultures. I'm going to take a step back here and say memorials are always shaped by contemporary politics. Memorials emerge out of the political moment in which they are created. This is, I would suggest, especially true of National Historic Sites because federal officials have for a very long time viewed public commemoration as a kind of patriotic alchemy, as a way of conjuring unity from divisiveness in this country by appealing to shared perceptions of a common past. Historic sites around the United States, therefore, evince a kind of deep faith in the nationalizing power of public memory. These monuments are supposed to serve the nation's interests by linking together its diverse peoples while also, and this is critical, legitimating federal authority. I'll sum all of this up by saying that out of common memories, the theory goes, Americans can forge a common identity. But Sand Creek is a very unlikely source for these kinds of sentiments. And so, sticking for a moment at this opening ceremony in 2007, there were dissenting voices, those of Native people, including here Eugene Little Coyote, who'd participated in the memorialization process, but at this opening ceremony rejected what they saw as a hollow offer of apparently painless reconciliation between their people and the United States federal government. Many of them feared that the Sand Creek Memorial might actually be a kind of a stalking horse for a very old assimilationist project for the federal government's long-standing efforts to strip tribal peoples of their distinctive identities. And so rather than accepting this site as a symbol of federal power, they portrayed the Sand Creek Memorial as an emblem of tribal persistence and self-determination. Other participants at this same ceremony expressed suspicions about this memorial for their own reasons, because the federal government was very unpopular on Colorado's plains at the time, because the site embodied, quote, political correctness, end quote, or as Marilyn Musgrave, Eastern Colorado's congressional representative in 2007, said, quote, gratuitous revisionism, end quote. And because some observers believed in the wake of the September 11th attacks, and with the United States in 2007 still embroiled in two wars overseas, that any sort of a federal site that questioned the military's rectitude in any way necessarily flirted with anti-Americanism. Over the next half hour or so, I'm going to suggest that these various controversies in 2007 at this opening ceremony echoed approximately a century and a half's wrangling over Sand Creek's memory, over how to remember this event, raising thorny questions about the relationship between continental expansion and two wars, 19th century wars, the Civil War and the so-called Plains Indian Wars, spawned by that process of expansion. When the site's sponsors tried to answer these very difficult, long-standing questions, they learned that Sand Creek remained a history front in an ongoing culture war, a culture war that is still very much with us today in 2025. Collective remembrance, it turned out at that time, and we know this still, can just as easily tear scabs from old wounds as help to heal them. Each new fight over American memory highlights the challenge of agreeing on a single historical narrative within a pluralistic society like the United States. But I'm going to suggest that the case of Sand Creek proved unusually complex because competing, sometimes incommensurable stories of the massacre haunted the process of memorialization. The first of those stories belonged to a Methodist minister who was an abolitionist in the years leading to the Civil War. His name was John Shivington. John Shivington saw the violence at Sand Creek as a noble part of civilizing the American West and also of preserving the federal union. Processes, again, westward expansion and the preservation of the Union during the Civil War, that he understood to be inextricably intertwined. You couldn't separate expansion into the West from the success of the Union. On November 29th, 1864, Shivington used blood spilled along Sand Creek's banks to depict what he believed was a masterstroke. With Cheyenne and Arapaho corpses still cooling nearby, he bragged in missives that he sent to his commanding officers and also to the press in Denver, Colorado, that his men, the troops that he with 1,000 warriors, end quote. His troops, Shivington said, had killed several chiefs and hundreds of their followers. In other words, rather than being embarrassed by what had happened at Sand Creek, he was proud of what he and his men had accomplished, and he was doing his best to publicize what he saw as their good work. For years to come, John Shivington would justify the attack at Sand Creek by pointing to this Civil War context. In spring of 1865, for example, Shivington testified before federal investigators that, quote, rebel emissaries were sent among the Indians to incite them, end quote. He pointed to the Dakota War, which was happening in Minnesota, and to the Cherokees' decision to fight with the Confederacy. In 1864, he said, a Cheyenne warrior named George Bent had served as an agent of the Confederacy, promising Colorado's native people that, quote, with the great father at Washington having all he could do to fight his children at the South, the Indians could regain their country, end quote. In this way, what Shivington was trying to do was make his victims at Sand Creek enemies, not just of Western settlers in Colorado Territory, but also of the Union, the besieged Union more broadly. The bloodshed at Sand Creek became then not just a triumph in the Indian Wars, but also in the ongoing Civil War. Captain Silas Sewell, pictured here by contrast, hoped either to forget what had happened at Sand Creek or perhaps to remember it very differently. Sewell refused to commit the troops under him to the fight at Sand Creek. He was a company commander, and he would not allow his men to engage in the fighting at Sand Creek. After it was over, he wrote to a friend of his, another officer named Ned Winecoop, insisting that the slaughter at Sand Creek had sullied the interwoven fights for the Union and the West. And so on that point, Sewell agreed with Shivington that the fight to claim the West for American settlers was intertwined with the fight to preserve the Union. But on almost every other issue, he disagreed with Shivington. Sewell, in his letter to Winecoop, cataloged terrible cruelties that had been visited upon the dead at Sand Creek. The bodies of men, women, and children hacked apart, babies cut from their mother's wombs, and on and on. Sewell, like Shivington, testified to federal investigators who looked into Sand Creek in the spring of 1865. Sewell recounted how the previous summer he had arranged a meeting in Denver between peace chiefs, some of whom are seen here. One of them was Black Kettle, you can see him now, and Governor John Evans and John Shivington. At that meeting, Shivington told the chiefs that if they wanted peace, they had to subject themselves to military law. Many of the Arapahoes and Cheyennes complied with that directive. Black Kettle's people had, for example, believed that federal troops were protecting them. They believed that they were at peace with the United States. Sand Creek, in Sewell's telling, had not been the glorious battle that Shivington claimed. It had been a massacre. Sewell's story took on added resonance when, on April 23rd, 1865, a soldier from the 2nd Colorado Cavalry murdered Sewell in the streets of Denver. President Abraham Lincoln had been killed a week earlier, and Sewell's death, like Lincoln, spawned conspiracy theories. For some observers, Sewell's Sand Creek memories became the unimpeachable recollections of a man who had been martyred for speaking truth to power, for standing by his principles, for being willing to call the actions of John Shivington and the soldiers who fought under him a massacre. A federal official looking into Sand Creek wrote at the time, quote, "The barbarism of slavery has culminated in the assassination of Mr. Lincoln. The barbarism of Sand Creek has culminated in the assassination of Captain Sewell." There were 3 federal investigations that looked into Sand Creek. All of them eventually condemned what happened there. One of them went so far as to call the violence a massacre. But many people, settlers living in the American West in the 19th century, refused to accept those findings. And so the fight over how to remember Sand Creek continued. In 1881, a social reformer named Helen Hunt Jackson published a book about the United States' history of mistreating Native peoples. The book was called Century of Dishonor, and it drew upon Silas Sewell's memories of what had happened at Sand Creek, noting that the Native American people there had been peaceful, that they'd been protected by white authorities, and that John Shivington's men had desecrated the dead. Helen Hunt Jackson argued that the United States needed to overhaul its federal Indian policy. With the Modoc War, the Red River War, and the Great Sioux War, including what was then known as the Custer Massacre, just over, officials in the Department of the Interior were ready to embrace Jackson's calls for reform. But even with the climate surrounding federal tribal relations shifting in that moment, again, the 1880s, John Shivington's perspective on Sand Creek still had defenders, including editors, newspaper editors in the American West, for example, at the Gunnison Democrat. These editors, as Jackson worked on A Century of Dishonor, called for, quote, "another Sand Creek," end quote. They wanted to wipe out the Utes in the aftermath of what was known as the Meeker Massacre. And you can see the memorial to that violence here. Infuriated by these kinds of sentiments, by calls for another Sand Creek, by defenses of John Shivington, George Bent, who was the son of a borderlands trade tycoon named William Bent, and his Cheyenne wife, Owl Woman, decided to weigh in on what happened at Sand Creek. So you can see George Bent here with Magpie, his wife. George Bent was both a victim and a survivor of the ordeal at Sand Creek, and he fought for years afterward to preserve memories of the massacre. Near the turn of the 20th century, the American West, in both popular culture and public policy, stood at the center of debates about the future of the United States. In fact, many people believed at that time that the American West was the future of the United States. George Bent worried that Native Americans had no voice in those ongoing discussions. And so he made the decision to begin relating tribal history to a man named George Bird Grinnell, shown here, one of the founders of the field of professional anthropology. Grinnell, though disappointed Bent, Grinnell took many of Bent's stories and then published them in his own books without properly crediting Bent. And so Bent began working with another scholar, a man named James Mooney, who was a renowned ethnographer at the Smithsonian. And then finally, Bent began working with George Hyde, who was a relatively, at that time, obscure historian. I'm sorry, I don't have a picture of Hyde. I should have stopped and said, I don't know that a picture of him exists. In 1906, Bent and Hyde published articles debunking Chivington's Sand Creek story. They wrote these articles together and they published them together. Although Bent allowed that he had fought for the Confederacy during the Civil War, he mocked talk of, quote, rebel plots to ally with the region's Indians. He made it clear that local tribes, including the Arapahoes and Cheyennes, were hardly staunch Unionists, but they also had no incentive to fight with the Confederacy and no interest in doing so. Bent then related details of Chivington's betrayal of the peace chiefs at Sand Creek, of a white flag flying over Black Kettle's lodge in the run-up to the attack, signaling that the camp was at peace, and of the Colorado troops' butchery. Bent saw the Civil War as a war of empire, not one of liberation. It was a war of conquest to take land in the West from Native people and hand it over to settlers. Bent outraged John Chivington's surviving men at the beginning of the 20th century. Major Jacob Downing, shown here, wrote in the Denver Times that Bent was, quote, a liar and a scoundrel and worse still, a half-breed, end quote. Downing then embedded John Chivington's Sand Creek stories in a narrative of the Civil War that heritage groups around the United States at that time were constructing. This was work that culminated in Denver with the unveiling of a memorial on the state capitol steps in 1909. The statue featured a plaque on its base cataloging, as you'll see, battles and engagements in which Coloradans had fought during the war. Again, these were battles and engagements that Colorado soldiers had participated in during the Civil War, and you can see at the lower right that Sand Creek was included among them. The memorial sponsors had smoothed away, the massacre's rough edges. They had cast John Chivington's memories in bronze. This made sense, by the way, at the time. As I said, heritage groups around the United States at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, as Civil War soldiers were reaching the end of their lives, heritage groups tried to memorialize the Civil War. This was a national effort. There were regimental histories that were published, document collections were put together, and of course, monuments were unveiled. Now I'm going to move forward less than half a century later. Now we're going to be in the middle of the 20th century when Coloradans worked against a very different political backdrop, and they began segregating memories of Sand Creek from those of the Civil War. In other words, separating Sand Creek from its Civil War context and instead associating the bloodshed at Sand Creek exclusively with the process of westward expansion. On August 6th, 1950, the state of Colorado unveiled two historic markers. The first, a marble slab, sat on a rise overlooking the massacre site. Here you can see that rise. And again, what you're looking at is the bottomland of Sand Creek, which runs dry most of the year. That marble slab echoed John Chivington. It read, Sand Creek Battleground. I hope you can make out that slide. It says Sand Creek Battleground. There was, though, as I said just a moment ago, a second marker unveiled on that day. That second marker, oh, I'm sorry, there's a better image of the Sand Creek battleground marker. Here, though, is that second marker that was unveiled. This is an obelisk, as you can see. This was sponsored by the State Historical Society, and it included a curious mixed message. It read, quote, Sand Creek, colon, battle or massacre, end quote. It then went on to label the bloodletting at Sand Creek, quote, a regrettable tragedy of the conquest of the West. A man named Leroy Hafen was the chief historian in Colorado in 1950. He oversaw the dedication ceremonies for these two monuments, and in his remarks, he noted of Sand Creek that, quote, some have called it a battle, while others have labeled it a massacre, end quote. Hafen wanted to duck that fight over what to call Sand Creek. And so he described the violence as, quote, a tragic engagement, an inevitable outgrowth of contact between the incompatible cultures of red and white men, end quote. Now, what was Hafen trying to do? Well, he was, first of all, obscuring responsibility for the massacre. He called it inevitable. It wasn't anybody's fault. It was just a byproduct of a cult of a clash of cultures. He was also divorcing it from its Civil War context, which made sense during the Cold War. Federal authorities at the time drummed up support for internationalism in the United States by encouraging Americans to recall the Civil War as an emblem of the nation's unalloyed commitment to freedom. Sand Creek, which at this time, again, the middle of the 20th century, was bathed in an increasingly ambiguous light, battle or massacre, Sand Creek didn't fit with this vision of the Civil War as a good war. By the 1960s, so again, now a decade later, decade and a half later, there were more changes in the United States' cultural and political climate, changes that seeded the ground for yet another reappraisal of Sand Creek. Late in the decade, a group of tribal activists formed an organization known as the American Indian Movement, or AIM. A year after AIM was formed, this is 1969, some of the organization's members helped to take over Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay, signaling the arrival of Red Power, as it was called, on the national stage. Now, a week before the beginning of the Alcatraz occupation, a journalist named Seymour Hersh broke the story of atrocities committed by United States soldiers in the Vietnamese hamlet of My Lai. And so in 1970, we're now in 1970, when an author named Dee Brown published a book titled Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, Brown found an audience that was eager to learn more about Native American peoples and keen to embrace critiques of American militarism. When writing about Sand Creek, Brown adopted a narrative arc and interpretive frame similar to Silas Sewell's, Helen Hunt Jackson's, and George Bent's. D. Brown focused on a white flag flying over Black Kettle's lodge, on Chief White and sang his death song, and on the brutality of Shivington's men slicing off their victims' genitalia. So you're looking here left to right at White Antelope, Lights on the Cloud, and Little Chief. Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee's impact could still be felt in 1998 when Congress created the Sand Creek Historic Site. But even then, even after nearly a century and a half of struggling over the massacre's memory, the United States Park Service learned that there were many enduring, very difficult questions that surrounded the violence, questions that largely remained unanswered, as I talked about at the beginning of my remarks. And then there was a new question that caught the Park Service entirely off guard. Where exactly had Sand Creek taken place? Park Service officials began asking. It turned out that from the Park Service's perspective, before Sand Creek could be memorialized, it first had to be found. A search ensued, and that search became contentious when disagreements over how to interpret the historical record divided the people looking for the site. Native American descendants of Sand Creek's victims typically based their understanding of the episode's history and geography on traditional tribal methods, oral histories, and on written records, including stories and maps that George Bent produced around the turn of the 20th century. Here's one of those maps produced by Bent. You can see that he has clearly mapped out Sand Creek, and he shows where various chiefs are camped in a crook of the bend of the creek. For decades, the Sand Creek descendants had used George Bent's maps and his work as a guide. They had made pilgrimages to a site near the monument overlook, that rise that I showed you. Here, I'll actually go back to that rise right now. They'd made pilgrimages to this spot for many, many years. The Park Service, by contrast, looked to other materials. In some cases, consulting records that were produced by troops who fought at Sand Creek, and then by looking at a map that was penned by a soldier, a man named Samuel Bonsall. I'm going to show you that map right here. Bonsall visited the Sand Creek site six years after the massacre. He visited the site with William Tecumseh Sherman, who was then in charge of the United States forces, the United States Army's forces in the West. I'm not sure if you can see at the bottom of the slide here, but it says Shivington's Massacre. Using what they called the Bonsall map, again, what you see in front of you, rather than the Bent map, which I showed you just a moment ago, Park Service officials believed that they pinpointed what they called the precise location of Black Kettle's village. It was located less than a mile upstream, they said, from the monument overlook. Archaeological findings, a band of artifacts unearthed during the site search seem to confirm this hypothesis. So if you look at this map, if you can see where it says existing marker, what it's showing you is that marker that said Sand Creek Battleground, that marker that sat atop the monument overlook. It no longer exists. I apologize. This map was made many years ago. And what you can see is each individual black dot that you're seeing shows an artifact site, a site where artifacts were found after an archaeological reconnaissance took place at the Sand Creek site. And you can see upstream from the site a plume of artifacts, and the Park Service pointed to that as what they said was confirmation of their hypothesis about the exact location of Black Kettle's village. Many of the Sand Creek descendants, though, were infuriated by this finding. They were angry that the Park Service was relying on sources produced by Sand Creek's perpetrators rather than its victims. They pointed back to George Bent's maps. Again, I'm showing you a close-up, a detail from that map, insisting that Bent, a Cheyenne survivor of the massacre, had placed Black Kettle's village, and you can look here at the second notation, number 2, it says Black Kettle's camp. They said that they had placed, that Bent had placed Black Kettle's village inside a crook of Sand Creek. So if you look at number 2 up toward the top, you can see where Black Kettle's camp was mapped by George Bent. The descendants then produced their own map of the massacre site, including Black Kettle's village, which they located precisely where George Bent had drawn it nearly a century earlier. And so here you can see two competing maps that were produced at the time during this site search. On the left, you see a map that's marked Southern Cheyenne, Southern Arapaho, Northern Cheyenne map of the location of the Sand Creek Massacre site. This was based, as you can see, on traditional tribal methods, oral histories, and the George Bent maps. And then on the left, you see the National Park Service's map, which locates the village, as I mentioned a few moments ago, upstream where those artifacts were found. Caught off guard by this dispute over competing cartographies and methodologies, the Park Service ultimately arrived at a compromise. A National Historic Site with boundaries capacious enough, expansive enough to encompass many different interpretations. You can see the boundaries of the Sand Creek Massacre Site here, all of which led back to April 28th, 2007, that opening ceremony, when the first unit of the National Park System to label United States soldiers perpetrators rather than heroes or victims opened to the public. Now, more than a decade and a half later, the Park Service and tribal descendants still have not found common ground on every element of how to interpret the Sand Creek story. But they have agreed on some fundamental issues. This site, they believe, should challenge visitors to grapple with competing narratives of United States history, to struggle with how the American past is shot through with painful, sometimes even bloody ironies. They've also agreed, as you've seen, that Sand Creek will no longer be labeled a battle, but instead will be called what it was, a massacre. And as a result of that, Sand Creek may no longer be misplaced in the landscape of American memory, I would suggest. I'm just going to very, very quickly scroll through a few additional slides and just bring you from that opening ceremony in 2007 up to the present. You can see here the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site. You can see the prairie on which it's located. It's an extraordinarily beautiful and sad place. I encourage people to visit it. It's a You can see here some of the very, very spare markings on the landscape. There is relatively little interpretation at the site. The Sand Creek descendants prefer it that way. They want the site to be uninterrupted. They want it to be a site of contemplation, a site where visitors can experience the sorrow. You can see in the background here, that is the monument overlook, so-called. You can see that rise coming up out of the prairie landscape. This is one of the paths that lead from, excuse me, I should say, to the monument overlook, one of the gravel paths. Again, a very, very beautiful site with uninterrupted view shed. This is the Sand Creek Massacre National Historic Site location in the town of Eads. Eads is the gateway community to the National Historic Site. This is also where the Sand Creek Massacre Research Center is located. One of the major initiatives that has emerged since the opening of the National Historic Site is an effort to allow researchers to come and do research about what happened at Sand Creek so that something like this can never happen again. Here, what you're seeing is the Colorado Civil War Memorial that I showed you earlier in my talk. This is in the aftermath of the lynching of George Floyd. Activists in Denver toppled the soldier who I showed you, who sat atop this plinth. That was a soldier mounted and looking west toward the Colorado Rockies. They took that monument down because they argued it was a monument to white supremacy and to the slaughter of Native peoples. That monument, that soldier, excuse me, is now at the Colorado Historical Society, also known as History Colorado. It's there and it's interpreted with a deeper sense of interpretation about what that monument meant for the state of Colorado. And then finally, some of you may have been lucky enough to have visited the Sand Creek Massacre exhibit, which was mounted first at History Colorado and now is in Washington, D.C. and available to you as part of Church and Society's at the Church and Society headquarters. This exhibit was overwhelmingly informed by the descendants themselves, shaped by their understanding of the past and their goals for how the history of Sand Creek should be recalled and experienced by visitors. You can see here Cheyenne and Arapaho accounts of the Sand Creek Massacre, soldiers' accounts. So it's Silas Sewell's account and Joe Kramer's account of what happened at Sand Creek. So around Sand Creek has shifted in the years since the massacre up to the most recent period. And then finally, just a very beautiful final image of the historic site itself at daybreak. Thank you all very, very much.
Thank you, Dr. Kelman, for your presentation. We had a few questions that came in, and so I would just like to ask some of these t uh, to you. So the first question that came in was, did the push for a U.S. national site come from the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes, or was it from the Interior Department or from another group?
That's a really wonderful question. The initial push for memorializing Sand Creek came from the descendants themselves, and also from a then United States Senator named Ben Nighthorse Campbell, one of Colorado's two senators. Senator Campbell was, and I believe still is, you're going to have to forgive me, I am not completely current on this now, but was a member of the Cheyenne Council of 44. And Senator Campbell represented the interests of the descendants and also of other Coloradans in pushing for the memorialization of Sand Creek, including the acquisition of the land that became crucial for the National Historic Site.
You. And another question that is tied to the memorial site, and if you are aware of, if the current administration, has the Sand Creek National Memorial Site been targeted by the present administration? Is it in jeopardy, if you are aware of?
It has been, I'm not sure if I not sure how comfortable I am with the verb targeted, though I think it's probably apt enough. But it has come to the attention of the current administration, and there have been some efforts to push for a reinterpretation of Sand Creek. I am not. I don't have an up to the minute update about that, but I know that there have been some efforts on the part of the administration to push for reinterpretation at Sand Creek, as well as at many, many historic sites around the United States.
Thank you. And the following questions are more historical questions. The first one
I'm okay
being,
with current events. I'm not trying to shy away from it. It's all right. I'm just trying to choose my words carefully. I suspect you have a very diverse group of people who are listening to this talk, and I'm trying to avoid offending people unnecessarily, though sometimes it can be necessary to offend. Anyway, go ahead.
yeah. Thank you. So the two questions, the first one being, did the troops know that the Indian warriors were not at the village since it was a chief's camp? And if so, did that cause them to go ahead and attack, not expecting any real resistance? And second question is, what role did Governor John Evans play in the massacre?
Okay, you're going to have to remind me of the second question because the first question is going to take me a moment to answer. Uh, John Shivington absolutely knew that the not only the warriors, but also most of the adult men were not in the camp. The warriors were on the Eastern Plains. They were contemplating a larger alliance with other tribes because there had been ongoing bloodshed in Colorado Territory for about a year and a half between soldiers, settlers, and native nations. And so warriors were in a different spot. This was a peace camp. The adult men, though, were outside of the camp because they had been directed to hunt and to look for food by the commanding officer who had directed them to camp at Sand Creek. So when John Shivington arrived at a nearby fort in the in the days leading to Sand Creek, he conferred with the fort commander, who informed him that exactly where the peace camp was located, and also informed him that the adult men in that camp would likely not be present. Did Shivington factor that in? I don't have clear documentation that indicates that, but I cannot believe that he didn't. I think that Shivington knew that this was going to be a camp where there would be relatively little resistance. What we do know is that Shivington understood that the soldiers who were serving under him, especially in the 3rd Colorado, were reaching the end of their term of enlistment. And he believed that he needed to strike. He needed a rousing victory for a variety of different reasons, including to advance his own career. That actually dovetails. You're not going to have to remind me of the second question. It dovetails with the question about John Evans. Evans had spent the preceding spring and fall begging the United States Department of War to allow him to raise a regiment of soldiers who would explicitly be tasked with fighting Native American people. John Shivington had issued two proclamations. Excuse me, I just misspoke. John Evans had issued two proclamations in the summer of 1864. The first proclamation urged Native American peoples in Colorado Territory to come into sites of safety and to declare themselves peaceful. In other words, to make sure that their intentions were known. And then he issued a second proclamation later in the summer in which he said that Colorado residents could go out and attack Native peoples, and if they did so, they could keep their property. It was effectively a calling for state-sanctioned vigilantism. So Evans knew both of these things in the summer of 1864. Heading into the fall of 1864, he badly wanted some kind of a major victory against Colorado's native peoples so that the Lincoln administration would, first of all, look favorably upon him. He had high hopes for a longer career in politics, and he wanted Colorado to become a state. He was very, very eager for Colorado to move from territorial status to statehood so that he might become one of its senators.
Thank you. And thank you for remembering the second question.
Sure.
Um, our final question for today. We are currently living in a time when truths are being erased or silenced or forgotten. Why is telling the story of Sand Creek Massacre important, not just for the Cheyenne or Arapaho tribes, but for all of us?
It's a great question. And I will give what I'm afraid is going to be a slightly philosophical answer. I would say that all of us, in one way or another, are a product of our history, not just our immediate history, but our more distant history. We are who we are because of our past and because of our ancestors' past. That's what makes us who we are. It's also what makes us who we are as a nation. I think that if we want to have a fair and an honest accounting of who we are and how we can become better, of how we can become a more perfect union, of how we can become better people, of how we can become better people in the eyes of God if we're believers. I think we have to take seriously our past, including its most painful elements. None of us are perfect. All of us have done things that we regret. This is true of nations, it's true of individuals, it's true of communities. There is absolutely no way that we can become better if we cannot be honest about our past. The study of Sand Creek and other episodes like this, and there are many of them, is an important part of that process. And so I always urge people to approach the past with an open mind, understanding that sometimes grappling with it will be painful, but that the pain is worth it. It's an important part of how we become better. I'm going to quickly say, I know you said that was the last question that you had. I wanted to note a couple of things. I can't see all of the comments as they are coming up, but I have seen that several of them have alluded to a report that was done by the University of Denver about the University of Denver's relationship to John Evans. There is also a report that's available online about Northwestern University's relationship to John Evans. These reports, I think, are really very, very important and worth taking a look at. You also can find PDFs of the National Park Service's site location study if you're interested in learning more about that. And you can email me. I'm easy to find on email. My email is akelman@ucdavis.edu. And I'm happy to do my best to respond to questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Kelman. Um, Today's webinar is the first of a two-part series. The second webinar will be this Thursday on November 20th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And I hope that you will join us as we hear from Reverend Dr. Nancy Nero, the author of Witness at Sand Creek, The Life and Letters of Silas Soul. A follow-up email will be sent to all of the registrants with additional resources, along with a link to this recorded webinar, and you will be able to find it in that email. A sincere thank you and gratitude to Professor Kelman for speaking to us today and for sharing with us and reminding us of the importance of truthful history telling and for your work that you do. Thank you so much for it and for speaking with us. And for all of you, thank you for joining us today, and I hope that you will join us on Thursday. Thank you again.
Thank you to everyone. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate spending the time with you. Have a great day. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye.